continue to bless their endeavors. And we pray, dear God, that we will walk away from tonight enriched and changed, and going forward, dear God, empowered to also empower others. Now these and all of the blessings we ask in the perfect name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. All right. Let me ask then. We have made a purchase of your book. It's a wonderful read. It is such a timely read. It's a piece that was given to me several months ago, and I picked up and just could not put it down. So fascinating. I'm curious, however, you obviously give a background on reparations. This is not something new. It may be popularized now, but it's not something new. But the book was published in 2020. Tell us a little bit about yourselves, please, about your life's work. This was not an easy lift. This took some time to put together. So what is it that motivated you to write this book and to write this book now?
Okay, but first, let me say many thanks, Pastor Augustine, for inviting us to share what is essentially an act of social justice communion with your community. And so we'd also like to say thank you to the congregants who are here and any other members of the audience this evening. We're very appreciative of the opportunity to bring this mission to the church community, because that is the community that has the moral authority to press forward with this cause. So how did we first come to work on this? Well, there may be slightly different paths initially before we converged on this project, but I'll have to say that personally, I was a reparations skeptic initially. Now, that was about 30 years ago, or a little longer. And at that point, an economist named Richard America, and yes, that's actually his name, an economist named Richard America asked me to write an introduction to a volume that he was editing that was later called The Wealth of Races. And that was a volume of essays that had been written by a group of economists who were trying to estimate what the size of a reparations bill should be. And I said to Richard at the point where he invited me to write this introduction, I said, well, Richard, this is something that will never happen. So why are we investing time in looking at this issue? We could use our time better elsewhere. I said clearly that the moral case for reparations was unequivocal. I just didn't think it was something that was a realistic possibility. And then Richard insisted that I read the essays in the volume and write the introduction and say whatever I wanted to say in the introduction. So he was saying, if you wanted to say this is nonsense and something that will never happen, you can say that in the introduction. I think he knew, though, that I would probably be persuaded in some way by reading these essays, and I was. As I read them, I became increasingly convinced that this was the only way to address the fundamental economic inequalities that confront the Black community, and that it was something that we needed to fight for, even if the odds were extremely long, that it might actually happen. And so in the present moment, I say, well, if you looked back at the year 1819, and you might believe that slavery would never come to an end, but that wouldn't mean that you shouldn't fight or struggle for it to come to an end. And similarly, if we were in apartheid South Africa in 1956, we might think apartheid will never come to an end, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have been engaged in acts of resistance against it. Now, this is proactive. We're saying that this is something that needs to happen rather than something that we're trying to prevent from continuing. And so our position has been, let's do the research, let's do the advocacy work to support reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery.
I would add that, Sandy and I both came from families that on both sides were descended from enslaved people here in the United States. My people on my mother's side from Virginia and from Alabama on my father's side. And my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, I grew up in Fort Worth, Texas, were very much involved in the civil rights movement. They were lifelong members of the NAACP. My mother took my sister and me to march when I was, I think, 8 years old. This was after the murders of 2 of the freedom fighters in Alabama, actually, 2 white people who had been killed. And so this is something that's been, talked about in my family for a very, very long time. The kind of inequalities that we were seeing. There were so many things that you would see just every day as a child, living in initially a segregated community and going to a segregated school. And, I would look at my neighbors who worked really, really hard. Many of them had 2 and 3 jobs. My mother had 2 or 3 jobs most of my life. And then when when desegregation came, and as a 3rd grader, I was actually, this is actually before segregation happened, because this was a parochial school that was one of the few that was admitting Black students. And going home with my white classmates, I would come home with lots of questions to my mother, like, what is going on? These just incredible distinctions I would see in terms of, just kind of the houses and, and you're looking at what, it wasn't about intellectual capital, certainly, but just, questioning what you saw on the ground, and no one really being able to explain to me, what was the reason for all this. But I certainly knew that it wasn't a question of Black dysfunction, because in our community, that was absolutely not the case. People working really, really hard, but still did not have anywhere near what my white classmates' families had to show for their effort.
About 10 years ago, I gave a presentation at, was it at UNC Chapel Hill? And Kirsten was there, and it was a presentation on reparations. And one of the editors from the UNC Press approached me. She had been in the audience and she had heard the talk, and she said, "You need to do a book on this." And so, with a little bit of hesitation, but not much, I said, "Yeah, well, that will be a good idea, but I need to write it with Kirsten Mullen," because at that point, we had been in extensive conversations about this, and we published a brief piece for The Root, I believe, on reparations. And so, we thought that this is something that we could produce together effectively. But needless to say, it actually took us 10 years to complete the book. And so that's From Here to Equality, which you have in front of you now.
Sure. And it's a wonderful read. I wanna ask a question that sort of connects a couple of dots, hopefully. Kirsten, I was really moved during Sunday's worship experience where you commented on the scripture from Leviticus that was read as part of the liturgy. If someone is wronged, you're supposed to make it right. The Bible has several scriptures that speak to that premise. One popular one, of course, is in Luke. There's the narrative with Zacchaeus, Luke 19. Zacchaeus climbs up the sycamore tree and he says, yes, and I'll all those I've defrauded or I've done wrong, I will return fourfold. I will repair fourfold. Dr. Darity, I appreciate your reference to the church and the moral authority we have. Now, you talk about the Riverside Church and James Foreman beginning in a sort of a recent context, I think 1969, 1 year after King's assassination. Our congregation is familiar with the Riverside Church, if nothing else, because Dr. James Forbes has been with us a few times. He's a wonderful preacher. And of course, he was the first African-American to serve there as the senior minister for about 18 years. James Foreman brought this to the church. He brought it to one of the preeminent liberal churches in the United States, to a church built by Rockefeller dollars. But he only was successful, and his group was only successful in obtaining, if I'm not mistaken, $500,000, or maybe less than that, but a small portion of the request. Could you
He asked for 500 million, right?
He asked for 500 million. Right.
And received 1/100th of that.
Yes, yes. So a
Right.
small, a small amount. Could you speak a little bit about the work that you foresee the church doing? And I'm asking the question about the church particularly because Georgetown University, which is a ministry, of course, of the Catholic Church, the Jesuits, they have gone out front and said reparations. Virginia Theological Seminary, a
But
ministry.
have they said reparations at the national
level?
or federal level?
Not at that level, in so many words, as in a favorable treatment for African Americans because of our past transgressions, because of the slave trade that they were engaged in with the Jesuits. The Episcopal Church, similarly with Virginia Theological Seminary, I think has said in so many words, reparations, acknowledgement, at least you speak to the ARC acronym, but acknowledgement of the past wrongs. Could you talk a little bit about how you foresee the church being engaged in the movement of restorative justice?
Absolutely. I think maybe we'll go back and forth. I wanted to start though by saying that my maternal grandfather was a Baptist minister, and my maternal grandmother's father was a Baptist minister. So, you're speaking to someone who has some vocabulary, in common to have this discussion. But Sandy was making a very critical point here when you were talking about these different congregations that were, that were talking about reparations. It's really important, we think, for the church to say, we understand that reparations is not something that a state or a city or any cultural institution can achieve. No community of faith has the capacity to eliminate the racial wealth gap. And that is one of the primary targets for us in any reparations program. I mean, it might be useful kind of to back up and talk about what we think the components of a reparations program would be. But it's important, we think, to say, yes, the work that we are doing as a congregation, as a community of faith, is about atonement, is about repair, but that we understand that only the federal government has the capacity to award reparations, to eliminate this racial wealth gap, because the gap is really large. People often will say, oh, it's just a check. And we would say to them, can we get back to that check? Can we run that experiment and provide what would be basically $840,000 per household? Let's make that distribution first, and then talk about what else we need to do for reparations. So for us, we would like to see communities of faith, petitioning and lobbying Congress for a national program of reparations that designates the eligible recipients to be Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. So basically, we're talking about two criteria, a lineage standard and an identity standard. So as I said, Black American descendants of persons enslaved in the United States. So we're talking about, individuals who, because for us, that racial wealth gap dates back to the period immediately following emancipation, when the federal government promised, their newly emancipated population these 40-acre land grants. And they actually had begun to settle some of those, families, up to 40,000 households.
Well, 40,000 individuals.
40,000 individuals were being actually settled on land that had been formerly held by Confederates. But, Abraham Lincoln is assassinated, Andrew Johnson becomes president, and he reverses. By the end of the year, that program was completely dissolved. But for several years, because there have been a couple of experiments that the federal government had engaged in, White people had been put on property, some of them for 2 and 3 years under this provision, and had already begun to, develop crops. They had had successful harvests, sold the products to the federal government for fixed rates, and had this experience of, being paid monetarily, for their labors. But all of that is reversed. Now, at the same time, we know that the federal government gave 160-acre land grants to white Americans, including recent immigrants from Europe,
And this is one of the points that that Martin Luther King Jr. made.
Absolutely.
He was talking about coming to get our
coming
check.
to get our check. It's like, it's our turn. And white Americans were not denied those 160-acre land grants. They got those land grants. We know that something like 1.5 million white households received those 160-acre land grants. And this is land in the Western Territory. So this is, approximately 270 million acres of land, which is the equivalent of all of California, all of Texas combined. But people need to understand this is land that was tax-free, that you could subdivide it, you could lease it, you could build on it. Any lumber, any wildlife on the land was yours to consume, to sell. But most importantly, you could bequeath the land itself and any profits from it to your children. And this is precisely what white people did. So now you're thinking, you're looking at, we're 5-6 generations away from that Homestead Act of 1862. And so you're talking about people who've been able to accumulate wealth over these generations. And this is wealth that Black people could have accumulated if they had been given those 40-acre land grants. Now, it's bad enough that Black people were only given 1/4, only promised 1/4 of what whites were promised, but then they were given absolutely nothing, right? One extraordinary example that we've learned of in terms of the Homestead Act, this is research of one of our colleagues, this is Jennifer Mueller, who asked her students to interrogate their own family's wealth positions and find out where did the money in your family come from. And she, the students were really skeptical about what they would discover. But in fact, out of a class of 150 students, 100 of them self-identified as white, about 12 or 13 as Black, and what does that leave? About 38 or so students who identified as of color. A full 25% of the white students discovered a land grant patent in their families. 25%. None of the Black students, none of the students of color had a land grant in their families.
So if I'm not mistaken, if I'm inferring correctly, the land grants, the Homestead Acts, the eligibility was to be poor. These were for poor.
No, not at all. At all. You simply had to swear allegiance to the United States. It had to be poor at all. It was not means tested.
And once the condition was set that you swore allegiance to the United States, it meant that the former Confederates would also have access to the land, as long as they would swear to that. Although initially the idea was that they were not supposed to have access to the land. But you had a significant migration of Southern Confederates to the Western Territories as a consequence of the Homestead Act. So very significant in terms of American politics and in terms of the distribution of wealth by race.
So in this one instance, the Jennifer Mueller students shared with her a family that received a land grant in the Panhandle area of Texas in 1880. And they decided that they would lease the land. So they're receiving an income stream, from the government, large S, basically. And then the father dies. So these are the grandchildren who are, learning this story. So the grandfather dies, and his widow decides to move with her 8 children to Austin, Texas, so that they would have, a greater likelihood of going to college. 6 of the 8 get a college degree. They emerge debt-free. The widow dies, and the 8 children decide to continue to lease the land. Then in 1980, a full 100 years after the land patent was made, natural gas is discovered on the land. It turns out to be, lucky them, right? It turns out to be the largest such deposit in the area. So much so that the revenue for the first year alone was over $100,000. I say we can kind of liken this to, a monthly dividend check from the federal government. So, in this way.
You mean a handout?
Basically a handout. So in this way, the federal government is helping white families build wealth but actively, so in the, in the 19th century, the way the federal government helped, Americans, white Americans obtain wealth was through land ownership. But when you come to the 20th century, the federal government strategy was to help people with home bill, come into play. You've got veterans coming home from the wars. They don't have jobs. They've been displaced, temporarily by women and Black people in some cases, in industry. And the federal government recognizes that they need to figure out a way to reassert the authority of these white men. And they put the GI Bill in place, which has benefits that can be used to, purchase a house with, low interest, sometimes no down payment, help them purchase a farm, help them get a college education. But the programs were allowed, the states and the cities were allowed to manage these programs themselves, as opposed to it being a nationally administered project. And this was actually the only way that the federal government could get the program passed, because the Southerners said, we're not interested in, any federal program altering our quality of life. We don't want our Black citizens to be able to buy houses, buy businesses, buy farms. That's not going to work for us. The only way we're going to vote for the passage of this legislation is if you allow us to administer this package, these benefits, and let us do it how we see fit. And what they saw fit to do was to exclude Black people, to exclude Black veterans. So much so that during one year in the 1940s in Mississippi, over 3,400 white veterans received the GI Bill benefit and the housing benefit, and two Black veterans received it. So over 3,000 white veterans and 2 Black veterans. I mean, it wasn't even, they didn't try to hide what they were doing. And they got no flack from the federal government, as a consequence, because they had already made that agreement with them that this was okay, for them to administer the program and disadvantage Black people.
Sure. Let me reference 2 very brief things, please. First, for the members of the congregation or the audience that are tuning in, even though we're in a webinar format, if you would like to send a question in the chat, Nikki is going to field the questions, and we certainly want to open up to our authors. The other piece I want to ask you is, what can we do now? And let me frame it in this context. You write about Reverend Garrison Frazier, the pastor or the minister, who's in conversation saying the check, no, we keep the cash, give us land, give us the 40 acres, right? The program that went forward, started to go forward and was drawn back by Johnson.
But to be precise, they were not offered cash.
Yeah, they weren't offered cash. It wasn't, they didn't have a choice.
Yeah.
Right, well, his request was for land for independence is my point, though, land for independence.
That's correct.
Well, and many have offered, many people have countered, though, that had they been given cash, they could have purchased land
anyway,
or whatever they wanted. But if it was land they wanted, if the government had given them cash, then they could have bought the land, gotten clear title, and it would have been a very different world.
Yeah.
So you really are hitting the nail on the head of the question I want to pose. As I think about Sunday's preacher, my friend, my brother, he's really way out front in Tulsa fighting for reparations. He's fighting for, on behalf of a geographically defined group where you can trace the lineage and figure out who was victimized in the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. If the government did approve reparations and started giving out checks now, how would we ensure that we would stabilize ourselves as African Americans and the money would not be squandered in a finite period of time? What would you suggest would be different now?
So let me start, and Kirsten will I'm sure will have something to add. But first, I want to start by going back to something that Kirsten was talking about, because I think this is really pertinent, which is the standards for eligibility for receipt of reparations. And you just mentioned that in the Tulsa context, there appear to be some clear paths of lineage that could be established and drawn out to indicate who should be the beneficiaries of any form of reparations. we're still somewhat nervous about the idea of reparations being location specific rather than being national. Although we know that in the context of Tulsa, they've been trying to get reparations since the day of the massacre itself. Okay, so so we kind of understand that there's something unique about the claim that's being made in Tulsa, but these events were not confined in terms of their repercussions. The massacre in Tulsa was an intentional signal to Black Americans that they needed to stay in their place.
Right.
That instances in which they achieved economic prosperity were instances that would result in white backlash, violent white backlash. So there was a message that was being delivered nationally through these various massacres, but especially the Tulsa massacre itself. And in addition, there was actually some forms of sanctioning and complicity by the federal government for these massacres. I think in the Tulsa case, the white terrorists actually made use of decommissioned World War I airplanes to drop incendiary devices on the Greenwood community. So this is not just a matter of Tulsa in isolation. This is part of the national atrocities that we think must be taken into account for making the case for reparations. Now, who's eligible? Well, there are two criteria that we have in mind. The first is an individual would have to meet a lineage standard. They would have to demonstrate that they have at least one ancestor who was enslaved in the United States of America. And in the final chapter of From Here to Equality, we actually propose that the federal government provide a service with professional genealogists to assist individuals in making their claim. And that these services should be provided to individuals at no cost to them. So that's the first condition, that you have to have a connection, a lineal connection to somebody who was enslaved in the United States. The second criteria is what we refer to as an identity standard. And this means that an individual for at least 12 years before the enactment of a reparations plan or the enactment of a study commission for reparations, whichever comes first, that an individual must have self-identified as Black, Negro, African American, or Afro-American. And our rationale here is that there are individuals who are living their lives as white Americans who can demonstrate that they probably have an enslaved ancestor. And we don't want people to suddenly declare that they're Black to be able to get reparations. So we want to identify individuals who have called themselves Black in an official document before there was any apparent monetary benefit associated with being identified as Black. So, yeah.
And then the amount of the reparations fund, for us has to be sufficient to raise the Black wealth or net worth to a level equivalent to white net worth. Black American descendants of U.S. slavery constitute 12% of the nation's population, but possess less than 2% of the nation's wealth. In 2019, the average Black household had a net worth $840,000 less than the average white household. So we, by that calculation, to bridge the racial wealth gap would require an expenditure on the low end of $11 trillion. Then we say the reparations fund must be distributed primarily in the fund of direct payments to the eligible recipients. When you look at other major instances of reparations for victimized communities, all of them have involved direct payments to the claimants. It's curious to us why, when the potential recipients are Black American descendants of U.S. slavery, the conversation, drifts to, all kinds of, third parties that, should manage these funds, or they should go to scholarships, or it should go to, community development funds. But when you look at what happened in Germany. The German government payments were made to victims of the Holocaust. The US government made payments to Japanese Americans who were subjected to unjust mass incarceration during World War II. And so the same principle of restitution should apply to reparations for Black American descendants of US slavery. And then we say the federal government must pay the bill. And this is for at least two reasons. The first is the federal government is the culpable party, having maintained this legal and authority framework that has produced enduring anti-Black atrocities. The federal government also is the capable party, the only level of government with the ability to meet a bill of at least $11 trillion. So when you look at the budgets of all of the cities in the country and all of the states in the country combined, that total budget is about $3.1 trillion. And we have said that the debt on the low end to Black people is $11 trillion. So to pay that bill, the states and municipalities, first of all, have to agree that they were going to do it. And then for 4 consecutive years, their entire budget would be spent retiring this debt. That's not going to happen. The federal government is the party that should pay this bill. And that's where we're putting our efforts. And we would like to see, communities of faith putting their muscle behind that, saying, we understand that there are a lot of other kinds of programs that we can engage in that will generate goodwill within our congregations, within our communities. And we want to do that. And we want to support a national program of reparations for Black American descendants of US slavery. But they're two different things. Part of the difficulty is one of language. We feel somewhat proprietary about the term reparations and think it should be reserved for this sacred mission of restoring Black American descendants of US slavery. And these other efforts should be labeled something else. When you think about the recent housing voucher program that Evanston, Illinois passed and tried to masquerade as reparations, that's not helpful. Our concern is that, these projects are off-ramps to reparations. There are a lot of people who will say, well, you've got a reparations program in Asheville, North Carolina. You've got a reparations program in Los Angeles, one in California, the state, one coming up now in New York, state of New York, one in Burlington, Vermont. You don't need a national program. Well, those programs are going to advantage a small number of people. I mean, the Evanston, Illinois program is perhaps in some ways one of the most egregious because the total amount of money that's available to individual is $25,000. So the city has recognized and admitted that from 1919 to 1969, it discriminated against Black people in the housing market. Now they have raised $400,000 and have said that the fund will have a ceiling of $10 million to cover all of the Black households that were discriminated against for that 50-year period. Interesting. And not only that, the funds can only be used for down payment on a new house or maintenance and repairs on an existing house. So if you are renting currently and are not, interested in buying a house, then you're left out. If you left the state, left the city even, you're not eligible. It's not a direct payment. The money goes directly to the bank. And some people have pointed out that the two banks that the city is working with on this project are the very banks that redlined, their parents and grandparents between 1919 and 1969. It's a real problem.
If you don't mind, I think you're as right as rain, but I wanna respectfully push back and play devil's advocate to ask the question in this way. You write about House Bill 40, which of course has been introduced. John Conyers did for years now, Sheila Jackson Lee, to ask for reparations. And you're as right as rain. The federal government is the culpable party, it's the capable party to fund something like $11 trillion. The question I have, though, given the inability to do anything productive in Congress, given the way we are so fractured, be it red, blue, RD, however you want to phrase it, but our inability to do anything in Congress right now. Are you open to alternatives? Even though the program in Illinois you referenced obviously was not is not up to par, but are you open to alternatives given the fact that there is gridlock in Congress?
Well, certainly, reparations is not going to happen. I mean, HB 40, which is a deeply problematic bill. We don't support HB 40 at all.
No,
Not in its current form. But if there were an executive order that the president would decree, that might be a way to get around it. And it also would make it possible for legislators who, for political reasons, don't want to vote for HB 40. It would give them some cover, perhaps.
We've had a number of presidential commissions, including perhaps most famously the Kerner Commission. And so there's nothing that would prevent President Biden from appointing a commission that would address or develop proposals for reparations. And that would be an alternative to relying on HB 40. But I do want to say this. There's a host of other types of actions that people are currently taking that they are calling reparations. And we think it's a real problem if we settle for these projects as alternatives or substitutes for a comprehensive reparations program. I think we're at a stage where it is no longer adequate to compromise or to accommodate over having a program that would eliminate the racial wealth gap by accepting something that falls far short of that. And so, I think we're in kind of more of an all or nothing position now in terms of how we think about this issue. The Black community has been waiting 156 years for this debt to be paid. And we think we should continue to wait until it is paid correctly.
Which is not to say that these other projects could proceed under a different name.
Right. I would call them racial equity initiatives, if you like, but don't claim that they're reparations.
I mean,
restorative justice matters.
Certainly, these are projects that the cities and states should have been engaged in all along. I almost want to see them called what we should have done in the first place initiatives. Yes, they're important, and hopefully, they will be done. Hopefully, they won't turn into another instance where Black people are led to believe that they're going to be advantaged in these projects, only to discover once again that they've been sidelined. I think there's a lot of room for cities and states, especially when you're talking about contracts, vendor contracts in particular. That whole landscape needs a tremendous reversal, turning it all upside down entirely. But that doesn't have to, that's no substitute for a national program of reparations.
Sure. I want to encourage also, I will ask another question in the interest of time to keep the dialogue going, but I also want to encourage members of the congregation to pose questions in the chat. Can you hypothesize, you gave wonderful examples, Ms. Mullen, on the example in the Panhandle in Texas. But can you hypothesize in the African-American community how things would have been different if President Johnson did not rescind the order, if that General Oliver Otis Howard was commissioned to carry out there with the Freedmen's Bureau, and if African-Americans would have received land, even the 40 acres, which obviously is just a quarter of the 160 acres from the Homestead Act that others received, but how would things be different in your mind's eye now?
So the land that was targeted for the freedmen was the strip that runs from the Sea Islands of South Carolina all the way to the mouth of St. John's River in Florida. A lot of this is incredibly fertile land. Now, we would say that one critical piece that needed to be in place would have been protection for those freedmen, that the Union troops, instead of being withdrawn in 1876, would have needed to stay in place perhaps indefinitely. I don't know. Or the blacks, the black households themselves would need to have been armed by the federal government to protect them. I would presume too that in addition to receiving the land, that they also would have, the black men at least, have the franchise, and also that lustration, that the Confederates would not be allowed to step back into political life. There needed to have been at least, some period, at least a decade, if not more, when they would not be allowed to vote again, and certainly not allowed to hold public office. But in fact, within a year, not only were they voting, but they were, becoming state senators and governors. I mean, it was just shameful.
Alexander Stevens, who was the vice president of the Confederacy, was sitting in the Senate within 5 years of the end of the Civil War.
That could not have happened.
It's outrageous.
If
they're traitors.
if the federal government had followed through on its own, plans, its own initiatives, I think things would have been very, very different. We know today that 25% of white Americans or households have a net worth of at least $1 million.
My word.
That could be black people.
My
that
word.
That could have been black people, right?
It's
My word.
like 4%.
Yeah, 4% of black people.
So, yeah.
The ability to accumulate wealth and build it over generations is tremendous. It's absolutely tremendous.
One of the points we make in the book to emphasize that the 40 acres, albeit 1/4 of 160 acres, is actually a quite substantial tract of land. We found a statistic that indicated that the average home in the United States is today is located on 0.2 acres of land, or 20% of an acre, which would imply that you could put 5 on an acre. And if you had 40 acres, a residential tract could be established with 200 homes on it. So 40 acres is not an insignificant amount of land. Now, I think initially the formerly enslaved, who had acquired a great deal of expertise about farming, the formerly enslaved would have used the land primarily for growing crops, but there is a wide variety of ways in which land use can be diversified for non-residential purposes as well as non-farming purposes. So that opportunity or option was denied folks because they were denied the 40 acres.
The whites who received those 160-acre land grants, if when they arrived and assessed the property that they had been allocated, if they decided for whatever reason that they didn't like it, they could switch. And some of them switched 2 or 3 times before they found the property that was to their liking. If blacks had had that kind of opportunity, to survey the property and discover, there's arable land, there's a water source, or maybe it's near a railroad. I mean, there are all kinds of things that could have made that a going concern for them. You mentioned Reverend Frazier, who was a spokesperson who in Savannah sat down with the Secretary of War and General Sherman. He said, we want land and we want to be left alone.
Correct.
He said, because there's considerable prejudice against us. And, he hoped that prejudice would work its way out in the future. But he was very aware that things were very tense and were likely to be so for quite some time. So, we would absolutely insist, if we were in charge, that these Black homesteaders be protected, that they be protected as property owners. And that the Black codes that were more draconian in some ways, I mean, these were these interlocking laws that, governed Black people's mobility, their ability to change jobs if they so desired, to shop around and get, good terms. for a contract. I mean, one of the many reasons that the newly emancipated white people could not take advantage of the Homestead Act is that they were already tied into one-year contracts, usually with the people who had enslaved them in the first place.
Sure.
So they couldn't take advantage of the Homestead Act, even if, they were legally allowed to do so. Their very livelihoods were constrained, under these Black codes.
Sure. Now, there is a question in the chat that speaks partially to something that you write in the book. You write about the land, I'm using the term grant generically, but the gift of land to allow Trinity College to move to Durham, which of course is now Duke University. A question is posed, do you think private entities should share a cost due to their participation in slavery?
So first of all, Duke University's participation in slavery is indirect, although it has a much stronger connection to the lost cause. And that's via its donors, especially Julian Carr, who donated the land that the university currently sits on. And Carr himself was not a slave owner, but that's a subtle distinction because Carr was a member of a family that owned slaves. So the human property in his family was not his personal property, but it was the property of his parents. They were the property of his parents. And so, when we start thinking about the proportion of whites in the states of the Confederacy who were members of families that owned slaves, that's a really large percentage of the white population. In the Confederate states at the low end of that proportion, the percentages are 25 to 30%. And at the high end, in states like Mississippi and South Carolina, the percentages ran as high as 55 to 57%. So you're talking about half of the white people in a given state who are living in families that own other human beings. So that's the connection that Duke has. It's through Carr's contribution as an individual who fought for the Confederacy and who also was a member of a family that was a slave-holding family. Now, that's one issue, whether or not the universities have complicity with slavery. And the answer is virtually all the most prestigious universities in the United States have a history of complicity with the slave trade and slavery in some form, whether it's directly or indirectly. So the great universities like Harvard, like Yale, my own alma mater, Brown University, all have very intimate connections to slavery and the slave trade. But the question is, should they contribute in some way financially to reparations? And we'd argue that, again, that these are institutions that should engage in acts of atonement, but they simply do not have the capability to provide the funds that would eliminate the racial wealth gap. One of the things that we discovered in just doing a back of the envelope calculation is that if generous donors to a fund for reparations, and this could include churches, this could include colleges and universities, put $1 billion into a fund on a monthly basis, it would take 9 centuries to get to $11 trillion.
My word.
It's not a small sum.
Yeah.
It's not a small sum.
Wow.
Yeah. So
that's some back of the envelope calculation.
The other point about the private institutions is that in some way they can get off the hook because they can say that even though whatever they were doing was immoral, it was legal. And so then we have to address which entity is responsible for the atrocities being legal, and that's the federal government.
Sure. So we're back to culpability and capability. Absolutely.
But certainly these institutions, though, could use their considerable muscle and influence to support reparations. I was just reading about in Dorothy Roberts's book on the whiteness of wealth, and she was talking about the Brewster family, which has its roots in the slave trade. They owned slave ships, and the younger son was outraged at having to pay inheritance taxes. And he, filed a suit against what is now the IRS. He initially lost the case, but then he went back. The case was repealed. He won on repeal, and then that was reversed. But then that very year, Congress passed a law in his favor. I say this, say that we don't have control over Congress. I mean, reparations are not going to happen unless there is a sea change in this country. White people, Tyrone Baines is asking, do we need white allies? White people represent 12% of the population. By themselves, they can't make this happen. We're going to need a change in the face of Congress. Now I will say this: the trends in white America are changing. 20 years ago, only 4% of white Americans supported a program of reparations for Black people. 16 years later, that number had risen almost 16% per year. 1% per year, right, for a total of 16%. Yeah. But currently, you're looking at over 30% of white Americans and almost a majority of younger white Americans. So the trend is moving in the right direction. Now, whether it will continue to do so, I don't have a crystal ball, I don't know. But it's interesting to note that in the case of the Holocaust victims, the numbers were much, much, much lower. Much lower. At one point, as low as 11% of Germans who believe that the Holocaust victims should receive restitution. Now, I don't want to say that the two, the circumstances are comparable or that the communities are comparable, but it's not always a question of having this overwhelming majority of people who are advocating. I think what is almost more important, I think, is not having mobilized opposition to reparations.
So on the note of,
I think a majority of Americans still to this day don't realize that Japanese Americans have actually received reparations
at all,
sure.
And they have.
Yeah. Sure. So to your point about mobilizing, Dr. Baines is asking the question because African Americans are all over the place as to who should get reparations, whether we can realistically get the federal government to fund reparations and other issues. What are your thoughts about how to get the Black community to galvanize to demand reparations?
So one of the lessons that we've learned from the case of Japanese American restitution is that specificity about eligibility is really, really important. Initially, they included not only Japanese Americans who were based in the United States, they also included Japanese Latinos. So the United States government not only interned Japanese Americans, they also interned Japanese Peruvians, Japanese Colombians, and they thought, well, all of these people should be included in our reparations case. But as they began to make the rounds of Congress, they got the message pretty strongly that the US government is probably not going to give money to these non-citizens. Now, maybe we can come up with some way to, provide some compensation for them later. But if we're going to get this thing passed, we need to be looking at Japanese Americans. And so, that's what they did. They said, all right, we're going to jettison this community so that we can focus on Japanese Americans. And that's a community that did receive the apology and $20,000 compensation for every single victim of incarceration. And then some years later, the Japanese Latinos did receive an apology and reparations, a much smaller amount of money. Now, I don't know if Mr. Baines is talking about Blacks from other parts of the diaspora, but we would say to that, certainly there are Black people who came to the United States not in chains, not forcibly, people who voluntarily came here. And we would say, Black and white immigrants who elected to come to the United States came here because of what they saw here in America. The businesses, the parks, the schools, the highways, these are all things that were built on the backs of the Black people who were enslaved here. And we think it's a little odd to us that, you come for opportunity, but then after you've been here a while and you're being treated like, Black people have been treated here since they came, centuries before. And then you say, well, we want reparations too. Now, we would say that absolutely these individuals may well have a case against the countries that enslaved or colonized their ancestors. So if they are from Antigua, from Trinidad, or from Jamaica, their claim would be brought to the UK. If they are from Haiti, that claim would be made to France. There's a long list of countries that have enslaved and colonized Black people around the world. The Congo, Belgian Congo. But we would say that these, the histories of these groups are not identical. And the remedies should not be identical. Now, there is in fact an organization called CARICOM that is actively seeking reparations for individuals from the Caribbean. Now, the CARICOM is not including Black American descendants of US slavery in its reparations claim, nor should they. But the reverse is also true. Black American descendants of US slavery should not be compelled to include all of these other groups in their claim. All of these claims have veracity. All these claims need to go forward. I think that there's certainly, we would certainly support, a full court press, comparing notes, comparing strategies. But our experience has shown that when you lump these groups together, instead of making them stronger, all the cases become diluted. And it makes it a lot easier for opponents to say, oh, I don't like this part, I don't like that part. Let's just throw the whole thing out.
Sure.
But keeping them separate, doing the research, pushing the statistics, I think is really, really important. But lumping them together is not, in our minds, the way to go. We're focused on these individuals who are descendant from the newly emancipated Black population who were denied those 40-acre land grants and consequently denied the opportunity to build and pass on wealth. Wealth is, the racial wealth gap is like the most visible evidence of the cumulative intergenerational effects of racism in this country. And that's what we're focusing on.
I would note that I think Mr. Baines made an additional comment in the chat to try to clarify that his primary concern seems to be the degree of opposition to reparations within the Black population that would be eligible in the US. And so, yeah, that's an important point. I think we estimate that about 30% of Black American descendants of US slavery are resistant to or even hostile towards the idea of reparations. I think that the only way you address that is by having the type of conversation that we're having this evening and hearing what the reasons are that folks express for being in opposition. One of the things that we frequently have heard is people saying that there's some sort of loss of dignity that might be associated with accepting reparations. Now, I'm not sure why Black Americans are more likely to lose their dignity than any other group that has received reparations. I don't think the Jewish Americans have lost their dignity as a consequence of any receipt of reparations payments. I don't think Japanese Americans are less dignified as a consequence of reparations payments. In fact, if anything, I think that they're in a better position psychologically and emotionally to address the history of victimization that they have been subjected to. And we have never received any compensation for our history of victimization. But there may be other arguments people have. I think what we need to do is to sit down and discuss it.
I was going to say, some people have said this in some ways dishonors the memory of our ancestors. But I would go back again, not just to Reverend Frazier, who said, we want compensation in the form of land. But he was among many, many other Black people who had attempted to receive compensation for their labors, who had attempted to free themselves. When we say Black people were the first abolitionists, they were freeing themselves. They were their self-liberators. Right. And they worked tirelessly as fugitives to, free other Black enslaved people and to, increase the likelihood that they would be paid for their labors. So, when you look at what, Black people who were close to that period of, crossing over from enslavement to emancipation, they were all about reparations.
Sure.
You don't see, we've not come across ever, any writing of anyone from that period who said, oh no, we would refuse reparations that they were offered. Now, I would say to Black people who... Well,
there was a point where Frederick Douglass said it was a bad idea.
True. Very early. But he changed his mind. Yeah, when he saw what, what was becoming, what was happening to Black people, how they were turned out in the street, how they were left penniless. You were talking about biblical references. When the Israelites left Egypt, they left with gold.
That was the sermon Sunday. We know that. That was the sermon Sunday. He preached it too, boy. He preached it.
Empty-handed. Now they did try to get it back later, right? But in the moment.
But then the Red Sea.
The Red Sea. But in the moment, the Jews recognized that you can't just turn people, you can't use people and use people and use people and then turn them out with nothing. And God's not going to smile on you,
right.
if you operate in that way.
Yeah.
So
we recognize that there are people who might truly believe that there is some sort of emotional damage that is done to them by accepting reparations because it preserves a victimization psychology. I mean, we've heard this language. And what we say is, well, you don't have to accept the reparations payments. In fact, why don't you sign on this particular piece of paper that whatever was to go to you can go to somebody else? Since you
should be compelled to accept reparations.
Yeah, it's not mandatory.
Right. I want to give an unsolicited commercial break just to say this is a phenomenal read. The church was able to purchase, I think, 25 copies. I'm encouraging those. We've got 800 people in the church almost. I'm encouraging others, everyone, to buy a copy of this. It's a phenomenal read. It's very empowering. One of the things, and I want to be respectful of your time because it's 8 o'clock now or just shortly thereafter. In closing, one of the things that really stuck with me, the acronym, the ARC that you used, and Ms. Mullen, you said apology. You used the A word apology a moment ago, which I take to be synonymous with the A in ARC, which is acknowledgement, the R, redress, and the C, the closure. If you all could speak a little bit about the ARC principles and how you see them manifesting, and we don't want to hold you longer than the time we imagined for the night.
So we'll go back and forth. I'll start with ARC, acknowledgement. And this is the idea that the perpetrators, the individuals who benefited from the atrocities that were committed against Black people, would acknowledge their part in that action. So it's not solely an apology, but it's also a promise to do something about it. We're talking about restoration. We're talking about, the case of Black Americans of U.S. slavery. We can't restore the people who are gone. But for the people, for their descendants, we can make a dramatic, a difference in their lives today. And so that's what we're focusing on with the acknowledgement.
Yeah. Redress is restitution. And as we've emphasized in this context, it should take the form of direct monetary payments to the eligible recipients in an amount sufficient to eliminate racial wealth differences in the United States. And we'll add, when we say direct monetary payments, it could be cash transfers, but it could also be something that's less liquid, which might come closer to addressing some of the concerns that people have about people rushing out and spending the money in a frenzy. People could be given trust accounts, they could be given annuity. There are other ways in which monetary payments can be made that would be less liquid and would have more of the character of being assets of wealth. And then there's closure.
And then closure, which in some ways may be the most controversial, because the idea here is that, once, Blacks and whites have agreed that the debt has been paid, and there are no new atrocities that are befalling Black people, and no reversion, to the older atrocities, that Black people would say to the federal government, there is no more need for racial, racial programs. Now, certainly, if there's something that happens with your family or in your town, that's a different thing. But when we're talking about this whole racial wealth gap reconciliation, then closure absolutely could happen. And some people say, oh my gosh, does this mean that we're gonna let white people off the hook and we'll never talk about race again? So, well, no, we said if there were no repetitions, if we didn't fall back into these patterns of centuries before. So yes, we would need to be vigilant. White people need to be vigilant as well. And we need to be holding people accountable. It's not a question of, oh, we've got reparations and now we can just, step away from political life. No, that's not the case at all. We would still need to be very active and engaged. And we would argue that, one of the reasons one of the things that would make it possible for Black people to be engaged in a more comprehensive way would be the receipt of reparations. I mean, you can participate in political life in a much more meaningful way when you can, support candidates. If the candidate knows that you vote and that you, are part of a PAC, for example, they might think twice before they stand at the mic and talk about why reparations is not a good idea.
Yeah. We also have to recognize that there is some 30% of the nation's population that supported the attempted overthrow of the national government on January 6th.
Yes.
And that population will be long present.
Yes.
They are the descendants of the Confederacy.
Yes.
At base. And if a reparations plan is put into place as a consequence of eventually 70% of the population being in favor of it, we have to be continuously aware that the 30% is extremely dangerous and must be dealt with.
All right. All right. Thank you all so much. Again, a phenomenal read, From Here to Equality, a phenomenal read. I highly encourage everyone on tonight, if you have not already gotten a copy of the book, to please get a copy. I see among those who are on Antonio Jones, our colleague who is the chair of the Durham Committee on the Affairs of Black People. He's already communicated. He's going to be in touch with you to continue sharing information. We are so thankful to you both. If you don't mind, as we close, I want to pray for you both again. And you were about to say something, I apologize.
We just noticed these two questions in the chat. I don't know if we have time to.
We have all the time in the world. I wanted to be considered to you. We have all the time in the world. Absolutely.
I'll take the second one, which is the easier one. So the question of national debt, this is a question raised by Mr. Pinckney. The issue of the size of the national debt is actually largely irrelevant. When the US government was trying to cope with the pandemic, and when it was trying to cope with the Great Recession, it spent huge amounts of money without increasing the debt. It increased the deficit, but it did not increase the debt because it simply spent the money without attempting to identify some way of financing the differential. And you know what? Most recently, it's been approximately $6 trillion, right? So the real issue with any increase in federal spending is whether or not you trigger inflation. And so that's what you really have to be concerned about. And in our book, we talk about some ways in which reparations funds could be dispersed to minimize the inflation risk. But yes, the deficit will get larger, but there's absolutely no reason for the debt to become larger because the size of the debt is a matter of policy choice.
And so regarding the question of Dr. Hayes, who is saying, I need to burn my sage tonight because this conversation is calling up a lot of historical pain. What do we do in the meantime? What do you suggest in terms of racial healing when restitution and reparations are actively denied? So, you know, we've been waiting 156 years for reparations. And, you know, I think we continue to do what we've been doing. We pray, we connect with like-minded souls, and we work with them. You know, we struggle together with them. You know, I think resistance and determination and focus and planning, these are muscles that all of us can strengthen in ourselves. And I think, you know, coming together with a common purpose can be incredibly, not just enriching, but empowering. And so I think, you know, the more we talk about these issues in our personal communities, whether it's your family, whether it's your community of faith, people you work with, the people in your book club, your golfing buddies, et cetera, your yoga, your Zumba classmates, you know, practice that muscle, you know, bring these conversations up in places where you ordinarily would not do so. I think it's really important to know where the people in your world intersect with you on these issues. But you know, I think self-care is very important, especially during COVID. And you know, I have learned myself that you know there are people who I had imagined might be supporters of reparation who are not, and I have eased away from some of those relationships because they're kind of toxic. So I think it's important, you know, to you know, when you're in the presence of politicians and they're near a microphone, call them out. You know, it's important for us to know who the allies are. But if you don't ask, if you don't risk, you know, putting yourself out there somewhat and saying what matters to you, what's important to you, what you're worth fighting for, you'll never know, you know, who is in your midst. And there may be allies in your midst, but there also may be sharks in your midst. And it's important to know who's who.
All right. Is there any other question that's outstanding?
Let's see.
I don't think so.
I don't think so.
Okay.
I just want to say that it's been a delight to be with you, Pastor Augustine, and First Lady Augustine, and to be among so many dear friends and beloved, you know, family members and friends in your congregation. It's really special to us to be able to come to St. Joseph's AME.
Well, it is special for us to host you, and we thank you so much for your time and for sharing your intellectual capacity with us. And if you don't mind, I just want to cover you all with prayer as we prepare to close. All right, heads are bowed, eyes are closed. Precious God, we love you, and we pause once again to say thank you. In particular, dear God, we thank you for this ministry that you have given to Ms. Mullen and Dr. Darity. We thank you, dear God, for their intellectual capacity. We thank you, dear God, for the time they have spent in preparation. And we thank you, dear God, for the years now that they will spend, have spent and will spend, dear God, in sharing the fruit of their labor. We pray that others will be strengthened by the information that they share. We pray that people will be encouraged to go forward and share the information with others. And we pray, dear God, that the U.S. government will one day make good on that check that's been returned for insufficient funds. We ask you to bless us as we leave this place, but never from your holy presence. These and all of the blessings we ask in the precious and perfect name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all so very much again. We appreciate you more than words can say.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very, very
All
much.
right. God bless you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.